You're listening to the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast with Paula Engebretson, episode number 262. Hey, everybody. How's it going? Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are diving into the topic of perfectionism, all things perfectionism, and in perfect timing, my neighbor has decided to begin their multi-hour, many-step process in doing their yard work. And I'm just going to continue recording and embracing the non-perfectionist mindset as it happens. And I'm going to try and edit it out in editing, but we'll see. Apologies in advance if you hear mowing and weed whacking and leaf blowing and all of the things. With all of that said, I hope you're ready because we're diving into all things perfectionism. And if you're someone who tends to skip anything that has to do with perfectionism because your brain goes, I'm not a perfectionist, this just does not apply, take a beat because I promise you there is something for you today. But before we dive in, I first want to mention, if you are new to the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast, welcome. I am so thrilled you're here. And I want to let you know that I created the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast roadmap with you in mind. If your brain ever gets overwhelmed thinking, oh my gosh, there's so many episodes, I have no idea where to start. Do I have to listen to them all? Do I have to do this perfectly? I've got you. That's literally why I created the podcast roadmap. It highlights the top 10 episodes to get up to speed and ready to work with your ADHD brain. Plus, categorized episodes of listener favorites about time management and procrastination and perfectionism and organization and all the things that we navigate with an ADHD brain. So if you want to get your hands on the podcast roadmap, you can tap through the link in the show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/map. Let's start by defining what perfectionism really is. Now, the dictionary definition is, quote, the refusal to accept any standard short of perfection. Now, the truth is, perfectionism can actually be kind of a confusing term because it shows up and impacts us in a lot of different ways. But despite the differences, there are some common threads that kind of weave throughout the perfectionist experience. And I want to start by exploring those. Okay, so first off, if you are someone who struggles with perfectionism, you may, not surprisingly, focus a lot on doing things, quote unquote, perfectly. But I want to stress here that your brain might not use the word perfect. Okay, for example, if the word perfection doesn't really resonate with you, you might think about the times where your brain is always looking for the quote unquote right way to do things or the quote unquote best approach. You might find yourself thinking, I just want to do it right. I just want to make sure it's good enough for this person or this event. I probably should have done more. I'm not quite sure I did it right. And when we actually slow down and check in on these terms, when we check in on what quote unquote doing enough means, we realize that enough is a completely unrealistic perfectionist fantasy, in the words of Karl Lowenthal. In fact, many of us set our standards so high that literally nobody could reach them. But because we don't pause to question this, our brains just kind of accept it as fact. Our brain just accepts the standard that we set, and we don't actually see it as perfectionism. We just think it's, quote unquote, a normal expectation. Plus, we then often add in the negative self-talk and the criticism to the mix that so many of us navigate, and it becomes even harder to recognize and challenge this perfectionism, again, because it just seems like a fact. I couldn't possibly be a perfectionist because I never do anything that's good enough. Right? Your brain might think, how could I be a perfectionist when nothing is ever perfect? If this sounds familiar, that is a perfectionist thought. Not surprisingly, this continuous striving for perfection tends to put a lot of our brains under immense pressure. And so we end up living in this constant state of stress and overwhelm, and we're always feeling like we don't quite measure up. We aren't quite good enough. We're not quite doing enough. And we're often hustling to try and prove ourselves, to get more done, to do enough. Now, here's the deal. based on what I've shared, again, some of you may be nodding along going, yep, know that one well, but some of you may not. As I mentioned, some of you might be thinking, I'm definitely not a perfectionist. I never do anything right. Again, that is very much a perfectionist thought. When you think to yourself, I'm not a perfectionist, I never do anything right, that is a classic perfectionist thought. But also, you might be thinking, no, really, Paula, I'm not even thinking that. This is just not me. I don't have to make everything perfect. I'm not trying to create the perfectly decluttered house or write the perfect grant proposal or create the perfect lesson plan. That's just not how my mind works. That's not how it sounds in my head. And if that's the case, you may relate to what one of my clients in my small group coaching program for ADHD Brains, We're Busy Being Awesome, what she shared in our private Slack community last week. So last week, we dove into the topic of perfectionism, and she wrote in the Slack channel, I have the direct quote actually, she wrote, "This has been one of my biggest aha moments in learning about ADHD. I never defined myself as a perfectionist because, holy moly, I was always just getting it done. Didn't even have time to check for errors, much less make sure it was perfect." Okay, so that was her quote. But it turns out it was one of the sneakiest forms of perfectionism that was actually blocking her all the time. So again, if you can relate to this idea of I'm not a perfectionist, I just don't ever have that need to do things perfect, stick with me because perfectionism shows up in so many tricky ways. But before we get further into that, before we learn how to really recognize and build our awareness around these more sneaky forms of perfectionism, I want to explore a bit further why most of us with ADHD brains do navigate perfectionism in some form or another, okay? Most of us adults with ADHD struggle with cognitive flexibility. This is one of the executive functions impacted in our ADHD brains. And when we think about cognitive flexibility, we essentially think about our brain's flexibility to see the gray areas in life. Cognitive flexibility allows us to adapt to new situations or switch or shift our thinking and see things in multiple perspectives. Okay, it's kind of like the ability to do mental gymnastics, have the flexibility for that. When we have ADHD, our flexibility is often a bit compromised if we've never really done any kind of work on it. Honestly, I've done a ton of work on it and it's still not super flexible. It's one of my most challenging obstacles with an ADHD brain. And that can make it quite difficult to move away from the black and white, all or nothing thinking. Instead of seeing that spectrum of possibilities, our brains tend to look into all or nothing. Yes or no, this or that. Okay, so how does that play into perfectionism? Well, perfectionism thrives in a very black and white world. Okay? It's all about the extremes of doing something perfectly or not doing it at all. And this kind of thinking can be paralyzing because it leaves us no room for making mistakes or for learning or for growth. It creates this environment where anything less than quote unquote perfect feels like a failure. And it's this really heavy burden to carry around. You know, for instance, let's say that you're working on a project for your boss or you're working on a goal and you hit a snag in your progress. And someone with greater cognitive flexibility might think, okay, well, this isn't going quite as planned, but let's just make some adjustments. Let's find another way. But on the other hand, someone navigating less flexibility, many of us with ADHD might naturally think something like, oh my gosh, I messed up again. This is such a disaster. I am never going to get it right. Why do I even try? So this kind of rigid mindset, it not only fuels our perfectionism, but it also heightens our anxiety, our overwhelm, our stress, which again makes it even harder to break free from that perfectionist cycle. Now, in addition to the cognitive flexibility component, which plays a big role, many of us ADHD brains also rely on perfectionism to try and overcompensate for any challenges or any obstacles that we face with our ADHD brains. So we might think to ourselves, well, I need to hustle and perfect and get more done and prove myself. I need to show up in a way to prove I am good enough and that I can keep up with everyone else despite having these different challenges. Plus, many of us with ADHD brains and ADHD tendencies, we tend to struggle with this fear of failure, or fear of failing or of disappointing other people. If you're like me, you've likely had times in the past where you may have dropped the ball or you missed the mark or you forgot about something. And these experiences can be painful and embarrassing. And it can lead us to adopt these more perfectionistic behaviors as a means of protection. Right? Our brains genuinely believe that if we can just make everything perfect, it's like an insurance policy. And it prevents those feelings of shame or inadequacy or guilt from coming up again if we can just get it perfect. Similarly, ADHD brains tend to set these rather impossible or unrealistic goals, and we do it a lot. And it's not intentional. We just really struggle with things like time blindness and our flood of brilliant ideas. And when you mix those things together, it leads us to set these really ambitious goals, and we genuinely believe that we can achieve them within these often ridiculous timeframes that we set because we're so time blind. I laugh because, honestly, some of the things I think I can do on a Tuesday is a little bit ridiculous. But if we're not careful, if we're not coaching our brain, if we're not aware of what's happening, and we do get these timelines wrong, we start making ourselves wrong. We start beating ourselves up. We tell ourselves, you missed the mark. You've messed it up again. And we turn what could have been a learning experience of, this actually takes this long instead of this long, and just turning it into math and data, we instead shame spiral in this huge pile of self-criticism. And then on top of this, if we do somehow manage to reach that unreasonable goal or standard that we set, rather than going, heck yeah, self, way to make that happen, that was really hard, we often use it as evidence against ourselves and go, I probably should have done more. I probably could have done better. Or we don't actually recognize the accomplishment as an accomplishment. And we instead go, yeah, that's what was supposed to happen. Of course I got it done. It's not like it's remarkable. This is just what you're supposed to do. Honestly, it's really hard to ever win when we are locked in this perfectionist mindset. And this is often because underneath all of this push for perfectionism is, again, some sense of inadequacy, meaning that many of us are often hustling to prove our worth and show others that we are indeed, quote unquote, good enough, that we do belong. And while this can be a very painful truth, I also think that when we can understand this underlying reason that tends to drive our perfectionist behaviors, and we can see that through the lens of an ADHD brain, it's a powerful first step in helping us address and work through these perfectionist tendencies, which ultimately allows us to find a more supportive approach to both setting and managing our expectations. Okay, so we've talked about what perfectionism is generally, and also why it is such a familiar obstacle for us ADHD brains. Now, I want to explore two powerful ways that perfectionism tends to show up. Some of you may relate to one of them. Some of you may relate to both of them. But I do have a sneaking suspicion that unless you've done a lot of intentional work on releasing perfectionism in the past or something, if you've done that, then maybe you won't relate to them anymore. But my guess is you will certainly relate to at least one of these two categories. If I am wrong, please let me know. I would love to hear about it. I would love to meet someone who has never dealt with this before, who has an ADHD brain. Seriously, send me a DM on Instagram. I am at I'm Busy Being Awesome. I'd love to hear about it. Okay, so what are these two lenses? What are these two ways that perfectionism tends to show up? So first of all, as we've seen, many of us tend to rely on perfectionism to kind of overcompensate for the challenges or the obstacles that we've faced because of our ADHD. So we think that we need to hustle and to perfect and to prove ourselves, to show that we're good enough, to show that we can keep up with everyone else, okay? Second of all, it can present itself almost as a form of procrastination. We're so afraid of the criticism, of bad feedback, or of doing it quote unquote wrong, that we hold ourselves back by continuously tweaking and perfecting and missing deadlines or never actually getting our work into the world. And these reasons, like I said, can be seen through two lenses of back-end perfectionism and front-end perfectionism. Now, I'm going to start with back-end perfectionism because this is the version that I think most people are familiar with. This is the version that we tend to talk about a lot. It's the one that tends to be depicted in media and things. Okay, back-end perfectionism is more familiar. And then we're going to look at front-end perfectionism, which is the form that I think is most sneaky and unfamiliar to people. Okay, front-end perfectionism is likely the version that tends to trip those of you up who think, I'm not a perfectionist. I don't deal with perfectionism. That's not a problem for me. Okay, if that is you, make sure you really listen to this second lens, the front-end perfectionism. Again, if I'm wrong, I would love, love, love to hear about it. But I have a sneaking suspicion. If your brain thinks you're not a perfectionist, you may find yourself in the front-end perfectionist category. Okay. But first, let's examine the more familiar, more talked about version of perfectionism, which is back-end perfectionism. Okay. So like I said, this is a very familiar challenge for many of us with ADHD, and it often shows up as this obsessive focus on refining and perfecting a task that we've already started. Okay, so we're constantly tweaking, we're constantly editing, and it usually prevents us from ever finishing the thing. It's when we get to 80% and we have a bunch of 80% finished projects. And for those of you who are very numbers driven, it doesn't literally have to be 80%. Okay, that's just an example. But for those of you who are familiar with back-end perfectionism, you know it can be incredibly frustrating. It often leads to missed deadlines, increased stress, missed opportunities. It takes a general hit on our productivity because, again, we often struggle to finish that last little bit, which we then carry around as this pile of unfinished projects that gets increasingly heavy over time. Now, one of the main signs that we're navigating back-end perfectionism is that we have this relentless drive to make every detail flawless or perfect or just right. Or, again, your brain might not use the word perfect, but it uses some flavor of that word. You just want to get it right. So this might mean that you're spending hours refining a document's formatting or adjusting the sentence phrasing, or you're ensuring that every visual element of this presentation you're creating is impeccable. Now, here's the deal. Of course, paying attention to detail is a beneficial thing, but the excessive amount that leads to perfectionism becomes this major barrier to many of us actually completing the task. So a common scenario for back-end perfectionism might look like this endless cycle of editing and re-editing. You might find yourself reviewing the same piece of work over and over and over and tweaking and changing sentence structures, and each time finding these new imperfections that you can fix. This cycle can, again, become a form of procrastination because it becomes this fear of finalizing and submitting that final project, right? And it keeps you trapped in this loop of perpetual revisions. Now, it might also look like painstakingly writing and rewriting every sentence, even though it's technically the first draft. So your brain knows, part of your brain knows, okay, we just want to get it out. Let's try and get out all the ideas. But then the perfectionist brain comes in and goes, yeah, but every single sentence has to be perfect as we're writing. And it refuses to let us have a ugly first draft. Okay? So this makes the entire situation incredibly slow and tedious when we force ourselves to try and get it quote unquote perfect rather than letting ourselves just get out a draft and then go back and edit. And if you have a brain like mine, it likely results in more perfectionism coming in when we do that really slow, tedious approach, because our brains also then say something like, well, I should be faster at this. I'm such a slow writer. I'm not a good writer. I'm a bad writer. Why can't I just write as fast as everyone else? Okay, so we tend to then layer more perfectionist criticism on top. Speaking of criticism, the fear of criticism, the fear of negative feedback is also a big component. It really drives this back-end perfectionism for so many of us, okay? So for those of us with ADHD, the anxiety or the fear about how someone else is going to perceive our work can, again, be completely paralyzing. And this fear can lead to an obsession with making the work, quote unquote, perfect. Some part of our brain believes that if we can just get it right? If I can get it just right, then I can avoid that potential criticism or rejection or disapproval. However, this fear of criticism often results in significant delays in actually completing the tasks, whether we're talking about big picture projects or small little to-dos. I can't actually remember if I mentioned this on the podcast before or not, so I'll share it again. But when I was still in academia, this was before my ADHD diagnosis, before I knew anything about rejection sensitivity or how intense my perfectionism was. So I was working on my book and I had turned in the first draft finally and got it to my editor, and they sent it out to get feedback from reader A and B. Now, in the academic world, your work is usually evaluated either in a single blind or double blind review. Okay, so they send out your work and it's reviewed by these people. Double blind review means that you don't know who the people are who are reading your work, and they don't know who you are. Okay, so they're just reading this anonymous piece of work and then they write back and they give their feedback. Single blind reviews means that they know who you are, but you don't know who they are, which is literally the worst when it comes to writing when you deal with rejection sensitivity. And of course, the single blind approach is the way that my university press worked. So again, I finally got this draft of my book to the editor. They sent it out to the reviewers, and per usual, reader A offered some thoughtful, helpful, constructive criticism, which really helped strengthen my book. Was it fun to see? No, but it was fine. It was constructive criticism. It was delivered kindly. Fine. It was helpful with my arguments. But then reader B made it, at least how my brain perceived this. Reader B made their feedback a personal attack on who I was as a human. And I offer this long backstory to get to the final point, which is that because of that criticism that I received, I literally did not even look at my book or the feedback for 6 or 7 months. And it actually took me a full year to finally finish the book because, again, I didn't know I had ADHD or how to support myself with my perfectionism and the rejection sensitivity. And after getting that criticism from reader B, my book publishing process essentially took an extra year. So when I tell you that I know how real that fear of other people's opinions and judgment is, I promise you I get it. And there are ways that we can learn how to support ourselves through it. I did, as I got my book published and other articles published. I now, as I'm saying this out loud, share a podcast every week with my thoughts and ideas, essentially in a single blind approach with thousands of people. Okay, so the vulnerability, sure, it's still there. It still comes up, especially with particular topics and things, but it is still a night and day difference once I learned how to support myself through that perfectionism quite a bit more. Okay, now what I just shared here actually kind of ties nicely into another important factor that can really fuel our back-end perfectionism. Okay, and this is imposter syndrome. So when we tend to doubt our abilities and feel like we're a fraud, that we don't belong, who am I to be doing this? That can also lead us to believe that our work has to be flawless in order to prove that we belong, prove that we are smart enough, prove our competence. And this can lead to, again, overcompensating through this excessive revision and edit, and ironically can kind of erode our confidence because we keep editing thinking it's not good enough, and it's just this perpetual cycle. And if you are new to the idea of imposter syndrome or you want to learn a little bit more about it, I will link to a deep dive that I did. I think it's episode 140, but I'm not 100% sure. So I will link to it in the show notes if you want to dive further into imposter syndrome and the way that it tends to present itself. Now, our perfectionist tendencies can also cause us to really kind of lose sight of the big picture. So instead of focusing on the overall goal or the purpose of the project, we start getting fixated on the minor details. And this tunnel vision can lead to this intense imbalance in time management, where we spend this inordinate amount of time on the aspects of a task that just don't really impact the final outcome. I'm looking at you, font choices and formatting and color schemes and writing and rewriting the opening few lines of your email, which ultimately prevents you from not getting to the final message, right? This intense focus on these little things that don't actually make a big difference, it shows up everywhere, okay? And this constant pressure to perform and do everything perfectly can lead into burnout. Constantly striving for perfection is exhausting and it's unsustainable. I mean, the emotional and mental toll of trying to meet these impossibly high standards all the time, it leads to fatigue, decreased motivation, and ultimately this overall decline in our well-being and our performance as well. Now, of course, there are many different ways that we can start working toward releasing some of this perfectionism, and it will likely be a different approach depending on your unique circumstances and what you're navigating. But with that being said, I think a key aspect of moving through that back-end perfectionism and getting the thing done is learning to set realistic standards and recognizing when a task is quote unquote good enough. What does done look like? Okay. This involves shifting our mindset from seeking that perfection to really starting to value progress and completion. It's about learning to really embrace and truly believe the concept that done is better than perfect, which can really help us move forward and complete those tasks without getting so bogged down in the endless revisions. Now, before you start taking action on all of this and trying to figure out how to do this quote unquote perfectly, the most important thing you can do is start bringing awareness and curiosity to the situation, to those moments where perfectionism shows up. So drop into that curiosity and go, when does perfectionism show up most often for me? When do I notice it? Make note throughout the week. Does it happen more often at work or at home or in certain relationships? Or is it when you're doing specific types of tasks or projects at work? What do you notice? Get curious and start increasing your awareness without judgment of where that back-end perfectionism shows up for you most often. Okay? So that's the first category, back-end perfectionism. Now let's look at front-end perfectionism. Okay? So as I mentioned, front-end perfectionism is a very common challenge for many of us with ADHD brains, but most of us don't actually recognize it as perfectionism. Instead, we call ourselves procrastinators. So front-end perfectionism is this tendency to delay starting on a task because we believe that everything needs to be perfect before we can begin. Now, just like back-end perfectionism, this can show up in a lot of different ways, okay? Like telling yourself, I can't get started on those lesson plans until the kitchen is clean. I can't focus until the kitchen is clean. Or I have to have every single resource I might possibly need before I begin. Or I need to have the entire plan mapped out perfectly. Otherwise, I can't get started. Or you feel this need to feel completely prepared and motivated before you can take that first step. Now, just like back-end perfectionism, front-end perfectionism also stems from this deep fear of making mistakes or not meeting our own high standards. But rather than getting started and then getting stuck with that last little bit left, we just don't get started with the front-end perfectionism. Okay? That fear that we have prevents us from ever taking that first step. So for example, let's think about planning. People who navigate a lot of front-end perfectionism tend to love planning. And in fact, front-end perfectionism shows up as this need for excessive planning or list making. We might spend this inordinate amount of time creating detailed plans and schedules and outlines and creating everything that we could possibly need ahead of time. And we make sure that we have the perfect planner to work for this plan that we're trying to create, or the right app, or whatever it is. And we focus so much energy on trying to have everything figured out perfectly before we start. And it's this fantasy planning approach where we not only stop ourselves from getting started because we spend so much time in planning, but then we also tend to create these completely unrealistic, unattainable plans that are impossible for any human to carry out ever in the time that we allowed. Another area where you might find front-end perfectionism pop up is to kind of clear out your entire to-do list of little things before you start tackling the big project, the one thing. So your brain might think something like, well, I can't get started on this project until I've read and answered all my emails. Or I'll get started on this after I type up all these notes and print out these things for my colleague. Or after I finish breaking down these boxes and putting away all the laundry and unloading the dishwasher, that's when I can get started. Now, I want to pause here because there's some nuance in this. Some of our brains actually do a lot better with a bit of an on-ramp where we do tackle some of the smaller tasks and create some little wins to help propel us into the bigger project. Okay, so if that is you, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're dealing with front-end perfectionism here. That might be a strategy that works really well for your brain. There's a difference. Okay, there's a distinction between knowing the specific smaller tasks that you want to do that help lead you into the bigger project, and then you actually work on the big project, and then having a regular habit of always only doing the smaller things, telling yourself, well, I have to get all of this done before I start the big thing, but then never actually starting the big thing. We just keep adding more smaller things to the front, right? When it's that situation, it's often front-end perfectionism that's serving as more of a distraction from getting started on the critical, more demanding task that really requires our focus and our creativity. Another area where front-end perfectionism tends to pop up is in research preparation, okay? So we might tell ourselves, I can't start writing until I've done all my research, until that's complete. Or I can't start until I've read all the articles or done all the research or read all the reviews before doing the thing. So this desire to be completely and thoroughly prepared with all potential information can prevent us from starting, not to mention lead to this excessive amount of time spent gathering information and burning out, right? Because we have little to no time or energy left for the actual process of writing or creating or whatever the thing is that we're researching. So again, this pursuit of quote unquote perfect preparation really slows or completely halts our progress. Now, another way that front-end perfectionism can show up is a form of avoidance procrastination. Okay, so this occurs when we might delay starting a task because it just seems too hard, too daunting, too overwhelming. And the thought of not knowing how to approach that task, or the fear of potentially failing when we did start, is again paralyzing. We tell ourselves, I might get it wrong, I might do it wrong. And this fear of imperfection leads to a complete freeze. And it prevents any action. It prevents us from taking those steps. Similarly, we might tell ourselves that there's a quote unquote right way to do this project or write this article. And we don't know the quote unquote right way, so we can't start. We might believe that we need to know every step of the process and have all of the answers before we begin. And again, this results in this perpetual state of preparation. We never feel totally equipped to move forward, so we stay in this frustrating spin cycle where we don't get started. And what we tend to do, which just breaks my heart, is that we adopt this label for ourselves that we're just big procrastinators. I just procrastinate. But in reality, we have front-end perfectionism getting in the way, because the brain genuinely believes there's a perfect or a right way to get started. Now, the last component that I want to offer about front-end perfectionism, it may come across as a little bit confronting when you hear it, but I think it's important to mention here, okay? Front-end perfectionism can also often be fueled, at least in part, by a desire to avoid discomfort, to avoid being uncomfortable, to avoid some sort of emotion. So starting a new task or a project or working towards some big goal, that can be incredibly uncomfortable. We talk about that a lot on this podcast, right? It can be very challenging, especially if we are uncertain about the outcome or whether or not we can do it or whether we know all of the steps, right? If we've never done it before, our brain doesn't know what to expect. And so it will want to just kind of avoid getting started because that's uncomfortable. Often unknowingly, our brain will avoid that discomfort temporarily by creating more things that you need to do before you get started. More little tasks you need to check off the list, more areas you need to clean, more steps you need to plan. But of course, this delayed start, where we just put a bunch of things in front of getting started, it just prolongs the inevitable. And usually, what happens if you're like me is that our anxiety and stress and overwhelm just increase over time with it and make it even harder to get started. So again, front-end perfectionism is this often overlooked yet incredibly significant barrier to getting things done with an ADHD brain. And it takes on many different forms, from needing a perfect environment to excessive preparation and planning before you getting started, and a fear of failure. And again, I will be very curious to hear if this form of perfectionism, front-end perfectionism, lands with those of you who otherwise don't identify with having perfectionistic tendencies. Seriously, please do let me know over on Instagram. Send me a DM. I'm busy being awesome. I would love to connect and hear whether or not this shows up for you. Now, I know I threw a lot at you today. I threw a lot of information at you. And for my fellow perfectionists, your brains might be like, okay, well, what's the next step? What are the 5 steps I should follow? Or how can I do this quote unquote right? And so let's start by releasing some of that perfectionist grip. Here's what I invite you to do if you want to start exploring this in your life, okay? I first want to mention that it takes some time. You know, if you search perfectionism on my website, just in the little search bar, you will find several different episodes about this topic because it's one that continually comes up. It's one that comes up for me, for my clients. It comes up regularly. The process of navigating the perfectionism does get quicker and easier, kind of each round up the spiral staircase, but it still comes up in different forms, and that's okay. And the first and most important thing you can do as you're navigating this perfectionism, as I mentioned before, create awareness of when it's showing up for you most often. Is it front end or back end perfectionism? And where do you notice it? Start recognizing those patterns. Start understanding without judgment why the brain thinks that doing it quote unquote perfectly in this particular situation or in that circumstance is so important. Get curious. See what you can learn about yourself and about your brain in these moments. I am telling you, creating this awareness for yourself is everything. It is so key. So if you're looking for a specific action step, that is it. That's what I invite you to do today. Start catching and categorizing those moments where perfectionism sneaks in. When does front-end perfectionism pop up for you? What about back-end perfectionism? What are the reasons for why your brain wants it to be perfect in this particular circumstance? Are you worried about direct feedback from your boss? Does your brain think there's a quote-unquote right way to start a podcast, so you have to research all the ways first? What's happening when those moments come up, and what can we learn from it? And of course, if you want to take this work deeper, I would love to work with you. If you're listening to this in real time, We're Busy Being Awesome is just about to open up for the August cohort, okay? We're Busy Being Awesome is my small group coaching program for incredible ADHD brains who really honestly get it. They know what it's like to navigate all of the daily struggle that we face, from time management to organization to prioritization to procrastination to perfectionism, emotional dysregulation, struggle with transitions. I mean, we get it. So if you are looking for a small, supportive space where you can connect with others and get direct support from me on your specific obstacles, I would love to see you in there. You can head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/group to learn more. And additionally, if you're looking to do this work with me in a one-on-one capacity, that is also an option. And I can put you on a wait list for when the next one-on-one spot opens. So you can learn more about that and sign up for a time that we can chat and you can share more about what's going on for you in your ADHD journey. And we'll make sure that one-on-one is a great fit. So again, you can get all of this information for both the group and one-on-one through the link in the show notes, or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/coaching and then navigate to whichever form of coaching you are most interested in. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you know someone who would love to learn more about navigating front end and back end perfectionism, would you be a rock star and share this episode with them? You could send it in a text or snap a screenshot and share it on your Instagram stories. If you do that, be sure to tag me at I'm Busy Being Awesome so I can give you a shout out. I truly appreciate you for listening and for helping me get these tools to even more ADHD brains who need them. Also, have you grabbed my free ebook called 10 Tips to Work with Your ADHD Brain? It is filled with actionable strategies that you can use to reduce your overwhelm, reclaim your time, and get things done. You can grab it through the link in the show notes and put them to use today. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.